Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Nordenberg. I am a former chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh and now have the privilege of serving both as the chair of the Institute of Politics and director of the Dick Thornburg Forum for Law and Public Policy. And it is in that last role that I do extend a very warm welcome to all of you today. In extending that welcome, I'm not only referring to the people in this room, but to everyone who is hooked up remotely to the program. And I do want in particular to welcome the political science students and faculty members at Pitt Bradford who are joining us this afternoon. And I should say to all of you that there was kind of a Bradford-like chill in the air here in Pittsburgh this morning. And I'm thinking that maybe Mother Nature did that to us as a way of acknowledging you. I am pleased also to note in particular the presence of Jenny Thornburg, the former First Lady of Pennsylvania, and Samantha Balbier, who is the director of the Institute of Politics. And my most appreciative welcome goes to the person on my right, Lisa Nelson, who is going to actually pull us through this conversation this afternoon. One thing that Professor Nelson and I have in common is a University of Wisconsin law degree. Her legal education is far more current than mine, and then she went on to get a PhD. So she outranks me in every respect, and it is great to have her here. Professor Nelson is a member of the faculty of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at Pitt. She also is affiliated with our Center for Governance and Markets, the School of Law, the Center for Philosophy of Science, and the Center for Bioethics, and is the Pitt co-chair of the Collaboratory Against Hate, which is a joint research and action undertaking of the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University. Her work has been funded by both the National Science Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation. She served on the Department of Homeland Security's Privacy and Data Integrity Committee during the Obama administration. She specializes in the field of science, technology, and society, and two of her major works are books titled America Identified, Biometric Technology and Society, which was published by the MIT Press, and Social Media and Morality, Are We Losing Our Self-Control, which was published by the Cambridge University Press. More current work, the work that actually brings her here today, has examined extremism and the acceptance of political violence as legitimate within the community of U.S. veterans. So let me first ask you, Lisa, how the heck did you get involved in this work? And in fact, I know it's a good question because Jenny Thornburg asked you the same question when she came in the door today.
Yes. Well, as you can tell by the history that you relayed so well, I'm a jack of all trades in some sense. And I was drawn to the collaboratory when they put out their call after the Tree of Life incident, and they were asking for people who were interested in combating hate and violence. And so I showed up to one of the forums And there was lightning rod discussions about issues that might be of interest to the collaboratory. And I was chosen along with Dr. Ron Parapovich to head up the collaboratory's working group on military and veteran and law enforcement extremism. And so it does sound a bit out of line with some of what I've done before, but in my mind, it was in keeping with some of the fundamental questions that I enjoy addressing in the sense of understanding how we define things, how we assess and empirically evaluate arguments, and also some of the political interests that go into defining problems and or technology and or solutions to problems. And so it seemed to me at first an uncomfortable fit, but as I got more and more interested in the topic and the philosophical basis of defining extremism, which I learned pretty quickly was much more complicated than I had originally thought, and that's part of what I want to convey here today. So it's been a very interesting road along the way, and I've learned a lot, and happy to share what I can today.
Well, and I should say, just to build on your comments, that in the aftermath of the synagogue shooting on October 27, 2018, hard to believe it's more than 5 years ago, there were determined efforts by people within the Pittsburgh community to make certain that this city became known as a distinctive center of anti-hate work. The Collaboratory Against Hate, again, a partnership of Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh, certainly is one example of that. And actually, Professor Nelson's story is vindication in some ways of the idea, because here she has a set of skills and experiences and interests that she probably never would have applied to this area except for the collaboratory and the opportunities that it seemed to be presenting. And I do want to acknowledge Susan Bida, who is the executive director of the collaboratory and is here today, and also Mark Hamlet, the former provost of Carnegie Mellon University, who is a good friend and the Carnegie Mellon co-director of the collaboratory, who is joining us remotely. A second initiative with which some of you may be familiar is the Eradicate Hate Global Summit, which was launched with the ambition of creating the biggest and best anti-hate gathering in the world here in Pittsburgh. We've done 3 of them now, and many people who are actively engaged in the area think we have accomplished that goal, though there is much more to do. And the new Tree of Life organization also is going to be a force in this area, and I see Professor Barbara Burston here today, and she is involved in developing their programming. So I think all of this is an array of activities of which Pittsburgh can be proud. You and I talked for about an hour. This was one of a number of conversations we had as she tried to educate me. But we talked for about an hour yesterday afternoon. And then I went home at the end of the afternoon, kind of making my relatively insignificant contributions to home holiday decorating. And the television was on in the background, and it was on cable news. And as you can imagine, the bulk of the coverage related to the war between Israel and Hamas, and particularly the release of hostages. But there also was significant coverage of the rise in anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim activities, including most particularly the shooting of the 3 college students with Palestinian origins in Vermont. The authorities, in talking about that case, were very careful in their use of language. They said, obviously, this was grown of hate, but they were careful not to call it a hate crime, at least yet. But what I'm wondering, Lisa, is whether that kind of violence would be categorized as political violence, or whether there is a narrower definition that experts, researchers in this area apply to that term.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that was quickly apparent to me in starting the research on veterans and to provide a foundation to answer this question is that the terminologies that we use are very unsettled, in some ways not very well defined, and in making claims about political violence or groups that are prone to political violence, there's a lot of, I think, ambiguity, but also questions about what the meanings are. So as a simple answer to whether or not it's political violence, I can't give you one, but I can tell you there's probably a legal definition of what we might consider violence, which would entail something that person did, which is to shoot people, which would be violence. But whether or not the motivation is political or whether or not it's a hate crime is something I think is best yet to be determined. And so I think part of the insight that I got from the work that we did on extremism is to just take a step back and question what the premises are and how we define the terms that we use. And to be, I think the biggest lesson is to be careful about extending those terms to things that we're yet unsure about. So that would be my answer. I know that's a roundabout answer. To the question is I don't know yet, and I think that's...
Well, but what you did say, and you do know, is that you ought to be careful, and that there is some danger in extending these terms too far.
Yes.
And one of the things that you and I have talked about is the work that has been done at the University of Chicago's project on security and threats, which has conducted a series of surveys on threats to democracy. And when I looked at the things that they were targeting as examples of political violence, they clearly all were directed toward moving government in one way or another. So protecting the voting rights of Black Americans and other minorities, ensuring that members of Congress and other government officials do the right thing, restore the federal right to abortion, prevent Donald Trump from becoming president, prevent Donald Trump from being prosecuted, prevent the teaching of critical race theory in our schools. And in each case, there certainly is something there that we don't know about the shootings that occurred in Vermont. And I think it does underscore the fact that not every act of hate-fueled violence is an act of political violence. Is there a growing acceptance of the legitimacy of political violence within the American population?
So to answer that question, let me just back up a little bit and talk about some of the work that and I want to point to Noah here, that we did on extremism and veteran extremism, and the idea that there are groups that are prone to violence and that they can be separated out from the rest of the general population and that they are then more likely to engage in violence. And one of the things that was quickly apparent in looking at parsing all through the databases that purported to measure extremism among the veteran community is that there was also a general rise in political violence. So it wasn't just that veterans were particularly more violent, but in fact, if you did a comparison between veteran violence and general population violence, there's an upward trajectory. So a simple answer is yes, it would seem that political violence is on the rise with some caveats. So there are some caveats to that as well, because if you're measuring violence, as we've already established, it can be defined by a myriad of different motives and can involve different kinds of crimes or violent acts. And so there's also the underlying problem of how we're gathering the data to actually establish that assumption. So if we're scraping data off the web, and there's been an increase in reporting since 1990, since the internet was not a thing before 1990, you're going to get more and more incidences of political violence showing up as a result of the increasing sources that are used to justify those claims. So it would seem, a caveated answer is that it would seem that political violence is on the rise. It's not particularly defined by groups that we tend to think are responsible for the violence. So this is one really compelling argument to me, or point to me, which is that we tended to think that veterans were responsible, more prone to violence. And to level that claim at someone is a very heavy claim to bear. That you as a group are particularly prone to violence is something that I think we should be very careful about doing. Yet I think we've been in moments where we've been prone to say that is the case. And I think a broader point is that if there is political violence that's generally on the rise in the population, the more fundamental question is, yes, there's certain people responsible for it, but why is it occurring? What is the driving force behind it? And I think we don't have a very good answer to that, because we've been focused on groups, different groups that are responsible for it, trying to limit what they can do or say or what kinds of things they can engage in. Whereas a more fundamental question is, if political violence is on the rise, is there something wrong with our institutions? Is there something wrong with the way that we're dealing with political dissatisfaction? So in some ways, I see political violence on the rise as an indication that there's something wrong with our governmental institutions, societal institutions, cultural institutions. And so I think instead of focusing the research on this problematic group or this problematic idea or ideology, that there's much more to be gained with a systemic understanding of where violence occurs and where might we be responsible for it. So that even when you're targeting groups and trying to censor or surveil or take actions against them in the form of interventions, that those might be spurring violence. We assume we're stopping it, but I'm not so sure, given if there's an upward trajectory, that we're actually stopping violence. We may be actually inadvertently contributing to it. And again, those are just my impressions, having been in kind of the depths of this question for a long time. And
well, I have a lot of impressions too. They're far less well formed than yours are. But let me go back to the fundamental question. I asked whether the acceptance of political violence as a legitimate tool was rising in the American population. And it seemed to me you answered that probably the acceptance was rising and probably the actual incidents of political violence are rising. Am I correct?
I would, again, caveated answer, yes, I would say yes, that seems to be the indication.
But you would say we ought to be careful about concluding that any particular groups or that any particular place along the political spectrum is an outlier in terms of a dramatic increase in the embracing of political violence.
Yes, and I would say part of that impression comes from having interviews post-survey with veterans. So there were a group of veterans who agreed to be interviewed, and I spent, it was supposed to be a 5-minute interview. I spent most of the time an hour on the phone with veterans. Sometimes they were in tears, sometimes we were laughing, but it was a really incredible experience. But what I learned is that there's an acceptance on both sides of the political spectrum and even in the center of political violence. And it's interesting to know when that point arrives for people. And what I found that was a similarly shared idea was that when, for those right-leaning, felt that when the constitutional obligations that the government has to the citizenry in the form of civil rights and liberties are usurped, there is a sense that there may not be, to your point, a legitimate way to have grievances heard, a legitimate way to have political expression heard. And the lack of ability of the institutions to accommodate those grievances, that dissatisfaction, those concerns, is, as many veterans pointed out to me, it's our history to push back against governmental institutions that are oppressive. And we've had many points in history where that has been the case. Those on the left pointed out to me that yes, violence might be necessary. The difference was that they were more inclined to use violence against groups that they disagreed with. So it wasn't against the government. Now this might switch. Obviously, the government might be what they like at this point in time, whereas if it were a transition to a government that they didn't like, they might see violence as being something that they would acknowledge as a necessary aspect to the response to government. But in this case, violence was a necessary aspect of what might be used against people or groups that were engaged in hateful acts or violence themselves. So there was a split, although there was a shared acknowledgement that there were some instances where violence was necessary. But to me, both of those instances of acceptance of violence indicate that we're not allowing for some form of legitimate expression of dissatisfaction. So that if you feel that it's right to attack a group or you feel that it's right to attack the government, there's still something wrong in the ability to express and to resolve those conflicts in society. So it says something about the culture and the society, but also the government at this point in time, at least from the perspective of the veterans that were very upset about some things that they felt that they had fought for and then were not being respected.
But to be clear, the veterans who sometimes were expressing an understanding of or a recognition of the legitimacy as they saw it of political violence weren't necessarily engaged in political violence.
No. But they were, to the question, because the question was, would you ever think it would be necessary to no, I didn't mean to say that they were not organizing to be engaged in violence. But to that question, could envision a point in time and understand where groups and or individuals would be engaged in political violence because of a huge amount of frustration was expressed on both sides.
And I think on this both sides issue, and where on the political continuum the acceptance of violence was increasing. I mean, here's where one of my preconceived notions kind of fell by the wayside. And if I go back to the University of Chicago categories to which I referred a moment ago, there was a not insignificant group of people who believed that political violence might be acceptable in order to protect the voting rights of Black Americans and members of other minority groups. And there was a not insignificant number of respondents. And again, this was from the general population who believed that violence might be legitimate to protect the rights of white people. Those are not the same groups of people, and they probably don't fit at the same points along the political spectrum. Similarly, as you may have noted, there was a not insignificant slice of the population that believed that political violence might be legitimate if used to keep President Trump from returning to that office. And there was a not insignificant group that believed political violence might be acceptable if used to prevent his prosecution. Again, those aren't the same groups of people, and they don't fall along the same places on the political spectrum. But overall, just to go back to another point you made, it does seem as if acceptance is increasing generally along the political spectrum.
Yes, it seems that would be the case. The question is why. I think that's where the inquiry is. I think we've dropped the ball a bit on the inquiry of that important question.
And I do want to go back to your work in particular with veterans. And here again is probably a totally unfounded assumption on my part. But it seems to me that since Timothy McVeigh, who had been in the military, bombed the courthouse in Oklahoma City, and conspired with others he had met while serving in the military to do this, there has been a heightened concern on the part of the public and of experts that maybe veterans were more prone to this, or maybe they were more likely targets of people who were recruiting for extremist groups. But your research did not bear that out.
As I said, if it's in a comparison between the general population and veterans, there are both upward trajectories. So to narrow the question to is violence among veterans increasing, the simple answer would be it appears that's the case. But when you put it in the comparison with the general population, it's not a standout category. So that would be I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I think a lot of the experts and or opinions on this question is driven by a lack of consistency in the data and a lack of consistency in how veterans and the crimes that they would commit would be categorized, and whether or not it's driven by their military experience and or a practice, that would give rise to criminal violence or political violence. So I think there's a lot of cross-cutting variables that have weakened what I think is the accepted mantra that veterans are more violent, we have a problem with veterans. That's a mantra that, when deconstructed, is far less sustainable than it seems.
Which is good news.
It is good news, yes, yes. And I think just to finish up on that, I think that's the main issue, is that I think you have to be careful about labeling, demonizing groups with these kinds of categories, particularly extremism. Extremism is not a legal category. It's a very fluid category. It is something that is defined differently depending on which organization you're talking about, or who's doing the measuring. And so to rely on those kinds of databases and those kinds of arguments for categorizations of extremism and then attach it to groups would seem to be really counterproductive if we're really concerned about reducing violence, political violence.
So let's go back and talk a little bit more about your work. So what did your investigation consist of?
So the first, and I'm going to look at Noah here, because Noah was instrumental.
You should raise your hand,
Noah Fair was working now for the Center for Governance and Market, but was instrumental in helping me dissect this myriad of databases that purported to measure extremism. And I think that the main takeaway, and if I had a slide here, I would show you that each organization that is making the claim about extremism uses a different definition. So some might include the threat of violence, some might include actual violence, some might include a criminal act. And you can imagine that there are many criminal acts that are not violent, right? So you can start to see how the inflation of the data can happen, or how the definition itself starts to encapsulate things that are, does this amount to a political violence? If someone is arrested for tax fraud, is that something that would be political violence? So it is this myriad of definitions piled on a term that doesn't have a legal check on it. So if you think about domestic terrorism, that is it's in the legal code, and then there's like about 57 crimes that might be included under domestic terrorism. And it's a discretionary charging decision or penalty enhancement. Extremism, there is no charge, there is no legal definition of it. You cannot be charged with political extremism. You can be called an extremist, as we all know. That happens quite a lot. And that, I would say, even the ambiguity of the term and the frequency with which it's banted about is something that is not very helpful for political violence. I mean, in the sense that by labeling somebody an extremist, you are, as one veteran told me, it's the height of intolerance. So not being able to include or understand a range of viewpoints is itself an extremist viewpoint, which I thought was an interesting spin on. So intolerance being the most extreme form of extremism. So I think that's the main thing that we discovered, is that there was no clear definition. The definitions drove a very disparate way of measuring and capturing data in those definitions, and that there was no legal check on it. So if you are using domestic terrorism, which is a legal definition that has crimes associated with it, the numbers are very low. Whereas for some of the databases, we're in the thousands. The disparity between the numbers were quite shocking to me, I had not been involved in studying extremism. I came at it from kind of a legal perspective, and then a philosophical perspective, which is there's a problem here. And it's a problem that should be addressed, especially since we are tending to use extremism in our political dialogue often, and with consequences. It's not without consequences to be labeled an extremist, or that your views are extreme, because it does mean you can't speak, you can't participate, you might be doxxed, you might be surveilled, you might be whatever the case might be. I think those are the larger takeaways, and the fact that then those numbers are used to demonize particular groups, like veterans, which I have a lot of sympathy for. I thought that was even more egregious, that there was, I don't know if it was clearly intended to be a demonization of the group, but it had the consequence of being a demonization of a group.
And to just go back to kind of nuts and bolts for a moment, the work that you and Noah did was principally survey work with interviews.
So there were stages of it. So first was the review of the databases and the review of the definitions, which I thank Noah for his help. And then we together developed a survey for veterans that was run through AmeriSpeak. And then I conducted the interviews after the end of the survey throughout the summer. And so that was the totality of the work, kind of building on. The survey work was really driven by what we discovered in the database review, because it was clear that extremism really didn't have a definition. So we started asking veterans, who do you think is extreme? They were aware that they had been thought of as extreme. And it was interesting to see that there are a range of institutions and entities, including social media, academia, government, Trump administration, Biden administration, corporations, all in a spectrum of extremism. And so to me, that may seem inconsequential because everybody's extremist then, but the idea then is that extremism is a moving target, and it tells you much more about your political perspective than it does actually in objective categories. So you could see that, and it became very clear, like in the conversations, that the discussion was going to go a particular way depending on what the political perspective was, but notably, everyone's an extremist. So that was the finding. Academia probably being the most extreme among those identified, along with social media. And the Biden administration, Trump administration, equally extreme.
You mentioned before how, depending upon the way research is conducted, inconsistent results may be produced. Mm-hmm. But in this particular case, we have the production almost simultaneously of consistent results, don't we, with your work and the work that was done by RAND?
Oh, right, because RAND completed a survey, I believe it was in September, because they were testing this idea that veterans were more prone to extremist or conspiracy ideas, and so they went in to test this among veterans, and discovered that they weren't, and so that it really, I think, cemented in my mind that there had been some mistakes made. I don't want to call them mistakes. I think just aberrations in the research that needed to be addressed.
Well, and there were parallels in the research approaches taken too. Mm-hmm. Survey work, group of 1,000 respondents in each case.
Yes.
The RAND study did not go quite as far as what I will call the Nelson Noah study because there were no follow-up interviews. Right. But again, some of the results to me when I read the RAND report were thought-provoking, if not jarring, when you think about what most people would assume. And I'm just looking at one page here and will give you a couple of examples. The veterans who were surveyed related to Antifa markedly more than they related to the Proud Boys. And the veterans who were surveyed related in very significant ways more to Black nationalists than they did to white supremacists. Can we trust this kind of data and evidence?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that I would say, after having many conversations with veterans, that they're very willing to share their opinion. So I don't think there's any bluster in the results. I think they're being pretty honest. It does bring up an interesting point about the empirical research that was done on extremism in veterans, which is that on the ideological factor of being a motivating consideration in the violence that veterans might be engaged in, there was very little interest in trying to track, I would say no interest in trying to track whether or not veterans had involvement in Black Lives Matter, for instance. So, and I'm not saying that's an extremist group, but I'm saying that's part of the bias that goes into the research itself, is that they're picking and choosing groups and ideologies that become then the motivating factor for the crime. And so we don't have a clear picture on some of the motivations that might be behind political violence, because we tend to say this is not politically motivated violence, or this is not a dangerous ideology. But again, pointing back to the survey research that we did, it comes down to where you stand before you see the extremists before you, more than the category itself being objective.
Before we run out of time, there are a number of things I want to do. Mm-hmm. And one of them is to go back to the other half of the title of our program, and that is polarization.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about the extent to which the country today is polarized, and the extent to which that condition of polarization may be driving some of the attitudes that we've discussed?
So it's interesting to me that affective polarization is really on the rise. And it's not that it's just been on the rise recently. It's been kind of in an increase since the 1990s. So that means that you see your political party or your political views very favorably, and those that you disagree with, you see very disfavorably. And so that has been on the rise. So I don't know, and again, what factors are driving it. I mean, there's many people who know better than I that have tried to measure what's driving it. Is it social media? Is it the internet? Is it cable news? But we're clearly in a kind of us versus them mentality. And I would say even in the veteran conversations, there was that came out. I think after about 15 conversations, I knew exactly where the conversation was going to go, because people had the same news sources, they had the same ideas, they had the same concerns. And it was actually, that was pretty striking. You know, they saw the same things wrong and the same things right. And I think, you know, the underlying to the point I made earlier is that I think it's on us to try to figure out what's driving these fundamental fissures in society. And I think, again, leveling the blame at this group or that group or this political party or that political party, it's a problem that we all obviously share because we're all obviously affected by it, even though I think we'd like to think that we're above it. But I think what I'm seeing from the research and from the conversations I've had is that we're all in it together, but see things very differently. And the question is why and how to get beyond it.
Well, you know, I swapped a smile across the room when you said effective polarization, because I first learned about that term from Professor Service from Carnegie Mellon in the long drives we used to make to Harrisburg while we were doing reapportionment together. But I guess basically my understanding is that the American public is not as polarized as you might think when it comes to ideology or policy issues, but this effective polarization is instead a feeling that you just don't like the people who are on the other side of the political spectrum or who are a part of the other political party. And one of the things that I read getting ready for this were the questions that had been submitted in advance. And here's one that ties into this kind of affective, that's AFFECTIV, polarization. And this person says, there are many issues on which Americans broadly agree, yet those who represent us in Congress seem to focus only on the issues that divide us, as they are incentivized to do so. My point is that a narrative of increasing polarization is useful to those in power because it prevents them from having to do any real work. What do you think about that?
No, I thought that was a great question. No, and I kind of harmonize this with what I said before, is that I think we need to turn the focus to not to tear it down, or to revolt against it, but to turn the focus back to the institutions that are supposed to be holding us together. And I think there are problems that are being that are evidenced in some of the polarization that we feel, that I'm not saying that we don't have responsibility for it, but there is also, ironically, an expression among both parties and both people on the aisle, or both sides of the aisle, that they want a solution. And it doesn't seem like our representatives are giving that solution to us. They're stoking. And why are they stoking the division? Maybe it's to get more airtime, maybe it's to get more coverage, maybe it's to get more tweets, whatever it might be. But there's definitely, I think there has to be a critical eye toward what the language government uses, the steps it takes, the practices that it engages in.
So there is, it seems to me, a clear example of what you were describing before. Mm-hmm. An institutional failure.
Yes.
If our representatives are not, in fact, representing us, but are representing their own self-interests, whatever those may be.
Right, right. And that can be a range of things, political, economic, or otherwise. Yeah.
So there was a question like that. I almost thought you could have written the question because it had to do with institutional failures.
I didn't write it. No, I didn't.
And there's one I thought could have been written by me, though it was not. And this person says, I feel like the rise of anti-democratic groups are happening more as the result of the widening wealth gap, low wages, and poverty in general. When people don't feel like they're participating in the acquisition of the American dream or achieving the country's promise of life improvements with hard work, they start looking for someplace else to belong.
Sure. Yes.
Does that fit with your views?
I would totally agree with that. I mean, the recent survey indicated that 36% of Americans believe that the American dream is not attainable. And that's a sad commentary on where we are today. And I would totally agree with these structural problems, whether it's economic or driven by an exclusionary policies. Those are things that we need to address because you don't expect to push people out and have them go away. I mean, I've never understood that kind of approach. Let's just silence them or push them out. It's not going to dissipate. It only grows in dissatisfaction and disenfranchisement.
Well, and in fact, and we have been trying to deal with this at the Institute of Politics, there are people in our midst who really have never had a fair opportunity to pursue the American dream. And then there are people in our midst who thought they had achieved the American dream, only to see it snatched from them. And if a person sees no opportunity for himself or herself, or worse yet, sees no opportunity for children, it's hard to imagine why they would remain loyal to a particular system.
Yes.
So what is it that we do to improve the institutions of government and the way that they're delivering for us or not delivering for us?
Well, I guess I would go back again to some of the conversations that I had with veterans. On the one hand, I think there's this idea that there is some allegiance to constitutional accountability that matters. I also think there's an expression that inclusion in the political process, there was a lot of anger about exclusion. We're being called this, or we're being described as this, and that makes me feel like I can't speak, or I can't do this, and I'm afraid to say that. And that, to me, is that is not an improvement on society, and it doesn't allow us to come together to try to fix some of the I think there are structural inequities that exist that are also part of the problem, but to polarize people with descriptions that exclude them from that process. It has to be a political process that's inclusionary, that has some goal at the end. And whether it's a constitutional accountability or some equity-driven solution, I'm not sure. I'm the person to ask about that. I mean, I err on the side of constitutional accountability just because I'm a lawyer and I find that compelling. But So, and it protects that inclusion of interests and voices in the process.
Let me ask you one more question, and I'm looking in the direction of Dr. Armony when I do. I did read one statement that I think came from a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, which said that the levels of acceptance of political violence in this country were basically at the levels that had existed in Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles. Rather than looking back, as you look around the globe now, do you see similar trends emerging in other countries in 2023?
I think, yes, I think you do, but it could be driven by some of the similar, we're not alone in our approach to violence. I mean, I think the imperative that we've had historically here in the United States is to tamp it down during the civil rights movement, anti-war protests, anti-Vietnam War protests. The imperative was to stop it from happening, and that only accelerates it. And I think there is I don't know if I can speak globally, but of course there's a trend, but I think there is dissatisfaction brewing, I'll say it that way. And that I think dissatisfaction brewing with governments and the approaches to society are something that you're hearing more about, and it does lead to political movements and or change that some would be uncomfortable with, but it is happening. You know, and in some ways, if you're having political change that's happening institutionally, you're not having hopefully the violence, but that's the hope. It's not the reality.
I did work in a number of the questions that were submitted in advance to the exchanges that I was having with Professor Nelson. I think we've got time for one or two questions anyway from the floor. If there are any that people would like to put to our expert guest. Yes. And would you go ahead and identify yourself? And there's a microphone.
Thank you. Vera Dannenberg, School of Medicine. And my question is, since the veterans identified us, academia, as extremists, would you please provide some insights why and how we can mitigate this in order to de-escalate this rise in political violence?
So I think the answer to that is that to back away from the idea that anyone, the idea is that none of us or all of us are extremists, right? So the point is that it's an ideological spectrum. And ideology in and of itself is not a bad thing. That's how we legitimate our institutions and practices and culture. Ideology is a worldview. It's the reality framework that we put on things. So their point about academia, when I heard it mentioned, is that we were out of touch, that we were political. I think there's some truth to that, having been in the institution for decades now. That we were concerned not so much with the improvement of society, but more invested in our own interests and or our political interests wherever they might lie. And so I think that's the common theme that I heard. And does that make you an extremist? No, but it means that the ideas that are being pursued tend to not be really relevant and or connected to or outside of the norm of what they feel is an ideological spectrum that we all have to abide by. So it's not so much that, they're extremists and we need to do something about it, but that the ideas were so increasingly outside of what was helpful or relevant and or driven by politics and ideology that was not in keeping with a kind of a perspective of what society would benefit from.
One speaker that we had for an IOP program, the All Angles program, was a man named Arthur Brooks, who had been the CEO of the American Enterprise Institute for about a decade, and he now has faculty appointments both at the Kennedy School and the Business School at Harvard. And the title of one of his many books was Love Your Enemy. And one of the things that he said is that, and I may get the word wrong, that if you disrespect others or you are disdainful of others, it's hard to come back because people remember those feelings. And I do think, fair or not, there is a perception that people within a university community typically don't extend the level of respect that they should to more ordinary people. And I think that is at the root of a lot of these feelings.
Yes.
And I remember when I was doing a lot of opioid-related work with a very distinguished member of our faculty who went out and sold his foreign car and bought a Ford because so many of these problems were occurring in areas just outside of what we would call Pittsburgh. And he didn't want to be labeled as someone who could not relate to the people he wanted to work with, and if he could, help.
Oh, that's great. That's an excellent point. Having grown up in rural America and currently living in rural America, I don't tell anyone I'm a professor. It's not something that I would ever share because I think there is a perception that you would, it's disdain. Yeah, it's that you're looking down your nose at somebody and don't have an understanding of what their real challenges are, and they are immense. You know, you mentioned the opioid problem, but there are immense economic issues that are part of rural America that I think academia is disinterested in.
And they don't have a future as they see it.
Yeah.
You know, the populations have declined. They've declined not because people don't want to live there, but because the opportunities aren't there. And so I think that's one dimension of the comment that I made earlier about having a shot at the American dream. Let me go back and say one more thing about veterans before we call it a day. And if I had thought about this before, I would have lined up my facts. But the last few years in the Eradicate Hate Global Summit, I've had the chance to work with the executive director of a group called We the Veterans. And this is a group that, among many other things, wants to have veterans stand for democracy. And to, counter this narrative that has gained some weight over the course of time. And they did something like this in the last elections where there were, so many needs for poll workers, people who would actually go to voting locations and make sure the processes work. Now, what I can't remember was whether they mobilized 60,000 veterans or 160,000 veterans. Either way, it was a staggering number to step forward and give of their time and get engaged in the democratic process in ways that probably made them feel better about it. And also in ways that kind of countered this less appealing narrative about the veteran community. Well, I want to say, Lisa, I've been looking forward to doing this. I'm glad we had the chance to do it together.
Yeah.
And I'd invite everybody to join me in thanking Professor Nelson for his book.
Thank you. Really, thank you for the opportunity. It was great.